The frost was still clinging to the grass when I spotted him, black as midnight, tall as a war chief's mount, standing quiet by my corral fence as though he'd been waiting all night. No saddle on his back, no rope burns on his hide, not a mark of any man. He watched me with a steady gaze, the kind that weighs a person's soul before making up its mind. I'd seen plenty of horses in my 38 years, but never one like this. Before I stepped closer, I knew he wasn't just passing through. Something had brought him here. And whatever it was, it had started the day before. Before I tell you how it all began, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe. If you've ever stood in a moment when one choice could change the whole shape of your life. I'm Jake Morrison, born and raised under the big Montana sky, on the same stretch of land my father staked during the homestead rush of '62. He was a man who measured wealth by the soundness of his word and the strength of his back, and he raised me to do the same. We learned early that a neighbor's need came before your own comfort, and that the Sabbath was for rest, no matter how many chores waited. Our table was simple fare beans, cornbread, salt pork, but there was always a plate set aside in case someone came to the door hungry. After Pa passed, I took over the spread, marrying Sarah not long after. We had dreams stitched together from hard work and quiet evenings by the fire. Then the fever came through, quick and merciless, and I buried her on the rise behind the house, where the wind carries the scent of sage in summer. For 3 years, I've worked this place alone, the days marked by fence lines to mend cattle to check and the slow passing of seasons. Folks in town see me as a man set apart, more comfortable under open sky than under any roof not my own. The land's been good to me, but she's no gentle companion. Summer fires can eat up everything you've built in a single night, and winter cold will freeze you in the saddle if you're not watchful. Still, I've held on every acre hard-earned, every herd kept through grit and luck. Out here, most dangers are plain to see. Storms, predators, drought. It's the hidden ones you've got to watch for, the kind that ride in wearing a friendly face or slip into your life without warning. That afternoon, I saddled Copper, my chestnut mare, and headed out along the fence line. The air was sharp, the sky that bright blue you only get after a spell of rain, and the hills rolled out like a quilt stitched in buffalo grass. I'd just turned into the narrow canyon when Copper slowed, ears forward, muscles tight. Around a bend, I saw her standing still, as stone partly hidden behind a fallen boulder, watching me. She wore a dress with beadwork that caught the light, her black hair falling loose over her shoulders. I reined in, keeping my distance, my hand raised in greeting the way my father taught me when meeting strangers on the trail. She said her name was Ayanna Eternal Blossom, and spoke of coming to this canyon to honor the paintings her grandmother's grandmother had left on the rock walls. We talked in the cooling light, our words easy despite the miles between our worlds. When her gaze kept returning to Copper, I learned of the horse she'd lost 2 winters back in a raid. What happened next wasn't planned, and it wasn't something you could take back once it was said. I told her to take Copper. And as she stepped closer to stroke the mare's muzzle, I had no way of knowing that gift would set in motion everything that followed, starting with the black stallion at my fence come morning. Copper's hoofbeats faded into the canyon shadows until all I could hear was the wind moving through the rocks. Ayanna rode with her back straight, the reins loose in her hands, her black hair trailing behind like a ribbon against the pale sky. She led my pack horse without a word, the animal following easily, as though it had been hers from the start. I stood there a while, watching them grow smaller until they disappeared around the bend. By the time I turned for home, the light was thinning, and the air carried the first bite of evening. The walk back to the ranch took most of 3 hours. My boots scuffed along the hard-packed trail, sagebrush brushing at my legs, the smell sharp and clean after the heat of the day. Shadows from the ridges reached long across the valley floor, and the sound of night birds came from somewhere beyond the fence lines. When I reached the yard, the lantern by the barn door threw a dim glow over the corral, and the house stood quiet with its log walls dark against the sky. Inside, I set beans to warm on the stove, slicing bacon into the pan until the sizzle filled the room. The silence felt different somehow, not as heavy, not as hollow. I ate with the door open, letting in the cool night air and the soft chorus of crickets. When I turned in, the bed seemed to hold me more easily than it had in years. Sleep came without the long hours of staring at the ceiling. I woke before dawn, as I always did, pulling on my boots and stepping outside to check the weather. The eastern sky showed only a thin band of gray, and the cold carried a hint that autumn wasn't far off. I'd gone barely 10 steps toward the barn when I saw him. By the corral fence stood a stallion taller than any horse I'd known, coal black with white stockings that looked as though he'd stepped through snow. His mane hung long, shifting in the faint breeze, and his chest was broad enough to carry a man across half the territory without stopping. There wasn't a rope scar or a brand on him. He didn't move away or show the restless dance of a wild one caught too close. He just watched me, steady and calm, as though my appearance was expected. I walked slow boots pressing into the frosted grass. At the fence rail, I stopped, keeping my hands easy at my sides. The stallion stepped forward, stretching his neck over the top rail until his breath warmed my palm. His eyes held an intelligence I couldn't put to words. We stayed like that for a while, neither of us pushing the moment. When the sun cleared the ridge, I made up my mind. I swung the corral gate wide and stepped back. The stallion waited a beat, then walked through as if he'd been invited to his own place. He tested the fence posts, drank from the trough, and moved about with the quiet authority of something that belonged. I worked the day as usual, checking the north pasture, hauling water, keeping half my attention on that black figure moving through the pen. By evening, hoofbeats came from the trail. Ayanna rode into the yard on Copper, a second horse in tow. Beside her was a young crow man, his shoulders broad, his gaze steady, and a family likeness in the set of his jaw. She swung down near the corral, her eyes going straight to the stallion. The look that passed over her face carried recognition and something like awe. "His name is Windrunner," she said, her voice low. "No person has ever touched him." I glanced between her and the stallion. "You've seen him before?" The young man spoke his English careful but sure. "He leads the wild herd between here and the Yellowstone. We watch him from far off. No one comes closer than a rifle shot." Ayanna stepped to the fence, the stallion lifting his head to watch her. "My grandmother told of horses like this. She said they appear when the balance needs to be restored." She reached into a small pouch at her belt and took out a shape wrapped in soft leather. She placed it in my hand. Inside was a piece of turquoise carved into a running horse, the stone deep blue-green and smooth from many years of handling. "This was my grandmother's grandmother's," she said. "The one who painted the canyon walls. She told us it would find the right person when the time came. I tried to hand it back, telling her it was too important to give away." The young man shook his head. "Some gifts must travel. They carry their medicine to where it is needed." Windrunner stepped closer, pressing his muzzle gently to my chest. The touch lasted only a moment, but it felt like something in me shifted an ache I'd carried, settling into something steadier. Ayanna's gaze met mine. "He has chosen you as you chose to give, without asking in return." Over the days that followed, I let Windrunner set the pace. There was no breaking to be done here, no forcing. I stood with him in the mornings, moved with him around the corral, let him grow used to my hand at his neck. Soon he allowed a halter, though never with rope pulling hard, only enough to guide. His speed and stamina were unlike anything I'd known, his hooves finding paths through rock and brush that would have turned any other horse. Something about him drew the wild closer. Deer began to graze in the open pasture. An eagle took to nesting in the dead pine near the house. Even a fox family claimed the old root cellar. Ayana visited often, sometimes with her brother, sometimes alone. We spoke of cattle and weather of trails and grazing of things each of us knew the other's people had never written down. One crisp evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, Ayana stood beside me at the corral fence watching Windrunner's dark shape against the pale grass. Her eyes followed his every movement, the set of her shoulders calm, yet certain. Gifts, she said quietly, are meant to flow like water. Hold too tight, and they dry up. I nodded, the last of the light catching on the carved turquoise horse now resting on my mantle inside. Windrunner lifted his head toward the far ridges, ears pricked at some sound only he could hear. I didn't know then what would come next, but the air felt like the moment before a storm breaks, when every sense sharpens, waiting. The days settled into a rhythm with Windrunner. Each morning I'd find him waiting near the corral gate, his dark coat shining in the early light, his breath making clouds in the cool air. He never pressed close, but he didn't keep his distance either. Just watched me with that same steady look as if measuring the day. I worked slow with him, letting the hours pass in quiet while I mended tack. Tack or hauled feed, my presence becoming as much a part of his routine as the sun coming over the ridge. Ayana came often, sometimes with her brother Little Wolf, and sometimes alone. She'd ride Copper across the pasture, the mare's ears forward, happy to see her. When she arrived, she'd always take a few minutes at the fence, speaking low to Windrunner in her own tongue. He'd flick an ear toward her voice, the muscles along his neck easing like he knew her words. In the afternoons, we'd walk the edges of the property together, her pointing out where choked cherry bushes would be heavy come summer, or where a spring might be dug to help the herd in a dry year. Little Wolf proved quick with his hands and sharper still with his eyes. He could spot a loose fence staple from yards away, and he read the ground as easily as a man reads a printed page. One clear morning, we followed a trail through the north pasture, him crouching to show me where a cougar had passed in the night, the pads marked deep in the soft earth. She has 2 kits, he said, tracing the smaller tracks beside the larger. They'll keep to the high ground unless they get hungry. His calm way of speaking made even the mention of predators seem like another piece of the land's order. By late September, Windrunner began ranging farther in the pasture I'd fenced for him, often with a pair of wild mares that had taken to staying near. They grazed in the open heads, lifting in unison whenever a hawk's shadow passed over. The mares weren't broken, but they didn't shy from me as long as he was close. It was as if his choice to stay here made it safe for them too. Ayana noticed this on one of her visits, her gaze moving from the mares to the line of mountains in the distance. The herd trusts where their leader rests, she said. The evenings grew shorter, the light dropping behind the ridges earlier each day. One night Ayana stayed to help me smoke venison in the shed, the scent of it mixing with the steady burn of oak in the stove. We worked side by side, turning strips of meat over the racks, speaking little but sharing the same easy silence. When the last of it was hung, we stepped outside. Windrunner stood near the fence ears forward, watching the horizon. A line of clouds was stacking over the peaks, the wind carrying the dry smell of snow. The first storm came 2 weeks later. Heavy flakes swept across the yard, piling against the barn and fence rails. I spent the morning breaking ice from the water troughs, my breath stinging in the cold. Windrunner moved with me, keeping just inside the shelter of the shed roof, his coat dusted white. The mares stayed close too, their shapes blurred in the falling snow. That evening I saw Ayana's band moving toward the valley north of the ranch, their horses stepping careful in the drifts. They set camp in the low ground near the creek, where the cottonwoods broke the wind. Through the weeks that followed, our lives overlapped in ways that felt as natural as the season. Little Wolf came most afternoons to help with chores or to share a meal, bringing news of the game they'd taken or the weather signs he'd read. Ayana and I traded what we knew. She showed me which roots to store for medicine. I showed her the tools my father had used to mend leather when there was no store within 100 miles. Evenings often ended with us at the corral windrunner, shifting his weight slowly from one hoof to the other, the sound of cattle moving in the far pasture carrying in the cold air. By early December, the snow lay deep enough that the trails through the hills were hard to tell from the draws, and the wind had a way of cutting through wool and hide alike. Windrunner learned the routes I took to reach the cattle in the farthest fields, moving ahead of me through the drifts, picking the surest footing. It saved hours and spared the herd from being hemmed in too long without feed. The black of his coat against the white hills was a sight I never tired of. One night after the chores were done, Ayana sat with me by the fire in the main room. She'd brought beadwork to mend a tear in an old saddlebag, her fingers moving quick and sure in the lamplight. Without looking up, she asked, "Do you wish you hadn't given copper away?" I thought on it a moment, the crack of the fire filling the quiet. "No," I said finally. I think it was the first thing I did in a long time that made space for something new. She nodded once, tying off the last thread and setting the work aside. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing with it the muffled sound of snow sliding from the barn roof. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called the sound, carrying far in the cold night. Windrunner answered with a low nicker from the corral, and I rose to throw another log on the fire. Ayana stood pulling her shawl around her shoulders. "The snow will be heavier by morning," she said. "We'll come by early to help with the stock." I walked her to the door, the lantern light spilling across the yard. Beyond its reach, the night felt wide and watchful. When the door closed behind her, the room seemed smaller, the quiet holding a weight I couldn't name. The turquoise carving still sat on the mantel, catching the firelight. I looked at it a long time, hearing again the sound of hoofbeats in deep snow, and wondered just how far those sounds might carry before the season turned. By midwinter, the snow in the high draws was too deep for grazing, and the wind drove hard across the open country. Each day began with breaking ice in the troughs, checking the herd's shelter, and seeing that Windrunner and the mares had feed enough. He followed me through the drifts without hurry, his head-level eyes sharp on every sound. The quiet between us had grown into something easy, the kind of wordless understanding you only get with time. Ayana's band stayed in the sheltered valley to the north, smoke from their fires curling above the cottonwoods. She and Little Wolf came often, sometimes bringing smoked meat or dried berries, other times just lending hands with the work. One gray morning, Little Wolf arrived early, his coat dusted white, saying a blizzard might roll in by nightfall. We spent the day hauling hay from the barn to the near pasture, the three of us moving in rhythm, stacking, tying, leading horses back and forth until the wind sharpened and the light thinned. That evening, Ayana stayed on after her brother headed back. We sat near the stove, her mending the binding on a worn bridle while I checked the stitching on a saddle skirt. The fire's glow lit her face steady and calm as her hands worked the leather. When she spoke, it was as if she'd been holding the thought for some time. "You gave copper without asking for anything in return," she said. I nodded, setting the saddle aside. "It wasn't something I planned," I answered. She glanced toward the window where snow was starting to drift against the sill. "Some gifts are meant to open a door," she said quietly. Over the weeks that followed, I found myself learning from her in ways I hadn't expected. She showed me how to read the sky 2 days ahead by the color at dawn, where to find bitterroot under frozen ground, how to dress a wound with herbs when there was no doctor for miles. In return, I taught her about rotating pastures so grass came back stronger, about bracing fence posts to hold against the spring floods. The exchange felt balanced, each of us adding to the other's way of living without crowding it. One afternoon, with the sun breaking through after days of snow, we rode the ridge west of the ranch. From there, the land opened wide, the mountains to the north, and the valley spread below, dotted with the dark shapes of the herd. Windrunner moved sure-footed along the trail, the mares close behind. Ayana drew her horse alongside mine. "My grandmother used to say generosity is like water," she told me. "The more you pour out, the more flows back in. Her words settled into the quiet air between us, carried off by the wind sweeping up the slope. Not long after the first signs of spring showed a thin line of meltwater along the creek, the call of meadowlarks returning to the open ground. The snow softened in the afternoons, leaving patches of earth where the grass would soon push through. One warm evening, as we watched Windrunner run the length of the pasture with his small herd, I found myself speaking without rehearsal. "Ayana," I said, "I know our peoples live by different ways, and there'll be things to work through. But I believe what we've built here is worth it." She met my gaze, her answer simple and certain. When we married, it was in the open yard beside the corral, the mountains still capped in white beyond. Friends from town stood alongside her people from the valley, the air carrying the mingled scents of pine boughs and wood smoke. We blended what we each knew, songs in two tongues, blessings from her elders, and from the circuit preacher who had come in from town. Windrunner stood at the fence through it all, his mane braided with sprigs of sage that no one claimed to have placed there. By the time the last of the guests rode out, the light was going gold across the pasture. Ayana and I stood together, looking over the land, the herd grazing in the distance, Windrunner still near the corral as the shadows stretched long. The snowmelt in the creek was running stronger now, and the scent of damp earth rose from the thawing ground. In the days ahead, there would be work enough calving to watch for fences to mend, and trails to check before the river crossing swelled. But as the sun dropped behind the ridge that evening, it felt as if the ground beneath us had taken a surer hold, and the air carried a promise I couldn't yet name. The weeks after the wedding carried a kind of steady rhythm. Snow still clung to the higher slopes, but the valley floor was opening to patches of green, and the creek ran faster each day. Ayana moved easily into the work of the place, mending harness in the mornings, or riding the fence line with me after the noon meal. Windrunner kept his mares close, though he was never far from the corral when we came in from the range. Little Wolf began coming by more often, sometimes to bring word from their camp, other times just to share a hand with chores. He had a quick eye for where the cattle liked to drift this time of year and knew the best places to drive them before calving. One mild afternoon, he and I pushed a small bunch out of a low draw where the snowmelt had turned the ground soft. The air was damp with the scent of wet earth, and the sound of water trickling over stone carried across the pasture. Ayana's knowledge of the land showed in small ways each day. She pointed out the first shoots of wild onion along the creek bank and marked the stands of willow that would be ready to cut for baskets. We began laying plans to expand the kitchen garden, talking about where to set rows so the wind wouldn't strip them bare. The days felt long in a good way, filled with work that had purpose from sunup to sundown. Windrunner's presence changed the flow of life on the ranch. It wasn't just the mares he brought in. Other wildlife seemed to follow his lead. Deer grazed closer to the yard, unbothered by our movements, and a pair of eagles began nesting on the rise east of the house. Even the cattle seemed calmer when he ranged near them. In the evenings, I often found myself at the corral, leaning on the top rail as he moved quietly in the fading light. Late in March, Ayana and I took a ride into the foothills west of the property. The sky was a clear blue, and the snowmelt had left the trails damp but passable. From the ridge, we could see the land spreading in every direction, the mountains to the north still capped in white. We talked about the summer work ahead, repairing the north fence, putting up a new shed for tools, and cutting enough hay to carry the herd through the next winter. She spoke with a certainty that made the plans feel already in motion. That evening, after we'd unsaddled and turned the horses out, we sat on the porch with coffee, the steam rising into the cool air. "The land's big enough for more than we've been doing," Ayana set her gaze on the pasture where Windrunner stood. "If we work it right, there's room for both our peoples to gain from it." I agreed, knowing the truth in her words, though neither of us said aloud what kind of effort that would take. The next day brought a warm wind from the south, loosening the last of the frost in the ground. Ayana's people came to help with branding their horses, tied along the fence, their voices carrying across the yard. We worked side by side, the smell of singed hair and dust rising as each calf was marked and turned loose again. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge, the pens were empty and the herd was grazing in the open field. That night, the house was full of the sounds of company boots on the porch, quiet talk by the fire, the creak of chairs as people settled in. Ayana moved easily among them, speaking in both tongues, bridging the spaces where words alone might not have been enough. I listened more than I spoke, letting the voices and the warmth of the gathering settle in the way a good rain soaks the ground. When the last of them had gone and the yard was quiet again, we stood together under the porch lantern. The air had cooled and a thin mist hung low over the pasture. In the distance, Windrunner lifted his head, his dark shape just visible against the lighter ground. There was a stillness to the moment, as if the land itself was waiting. I couldn't yet name what for, but it felt close enough to touch. Spring settled in with warm winds and the steady rise of the creek. Grass came up thick in the lower pastures, and the herd spread out to graze along the flats. Ayana and I spent most mornings on horseback, riding the perimeter, to be sure winter's storms hadn't left the fences weak. Windrunner and his mares often shadowed our route, moving in the open, with the kind of ease that made them look part of the land itself. One afternoon, Little Wolf rode in from the north ridge, his horse lathered from the climb. He swung down at the corral and said he'd spotted strangers camped a mile beyond the western boundary. From his description, 3 men, 2 pack mules, and a string of gear. It didn't sound like passing travelers. "They've been there more than a night," he said, pulling a canteen from his saddle. "I saw their fire ring cold in the morning and smoking again at dusk." We agreed to keep watch without stirring trouble. The next day, Ayana and I took the long trail toward that ridge. The air was sharp with the scent of pine, and the ground held the damp from an overnight shower. Near the western fence line, we found signs Little Wolf had spoken of cut branches for a lean-to fresh hoof prints leading toward the creek. Whoever they were, they kept to themselves that day. But the presence was enough to keep my thoughts tight. Back at the ranch, work went on. We repaired the north corral, added rails, where the posts had shifted in the thaw, and brought in supplies from town: flour, coffee, salt, and new blades for the mower. Ayana stopped by the schoolhouse, while I loaded the wagon, speaking with Mrs. Caldwell, who ran the place, about trading fresh vegetables come summer for books the children in her band could use. The talk of trade and shared work made the miles back home pass easier. In early May, the first calves were old enough to move with the herd. We drove them up to the high meadow, the sky bright and clear. Meadowlarks calling from the fence posts. Windrunner ran alongside for part of the drive, then broke off to lead his mares toward the far ridge. It struck me that he seemed to know the flow of our work as well as any hand on the place. One evening, with the sun low and the air cooling, Ayana and I sat outside the barn, mending a harness strap. The sound of the creek reached us faint from the draw, and the smell of fresh-cut hay drifted from the stack. She worked the awl through the leather and said, "Your father built this place strong. Now it can hold more than he ever thought it could." Her eyes followed a pair of deer moving through the pasture. "It can hold more people, more ways of living, if we choose it." The next morning, Little Wolf arrived early with news. He'd spoken with a trapper who'd passed the strangers' camp and learned they were surveying landmarking trails and speaking of new lines to be drawn. None of it sat well. Survey stakes often meant change that came without asking, and change that large could reach farther than fence lines. Ayana listened without interrupting, her hand resting on Windrunner's neck as the stallion nosed through the hay pile. We decided to keep working as planned, but remain watchful. That afternoon, we cut a new path from the main yard to the south pasture, clearing brush and hauling the limbs to a burn pile. The smell of green wood smoke rose into the clear sky, curling away toward the mountains. In the distance, thunder rolled low and steady, though no storm showed yet on the horizon. By week's end, the creek ran high with snowmelt, and the evenings held that restless feel that comes before weather shifts. On Saturday, I took the wagon into town for mail and supplies. The streets were busier than usual wagons from farther out, and a few riders I didn't recognize. At the mercantile, I heard talk of new buyers looking at land west of the ridge, their interest said to be backed by railroad men. I kept my part of the errand short and headed back before the sun dipped too low. When I reached the ranch, the yard was quiet, the only movement Windrunner's dark shape by the corral. Ayanna came from the house carrying a folded paper. "A rider brought this," she said, handing it over. The envelope was sealed, the handwriting careful, unfamiliar. I turned it over once in my hands, feeling the weight of whatever it held. I broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The writing was neat and deliberate, each word carefully placed. It came from a man named Charles Hensley, representing a company claiming interest in unused lands west of the ridge. He requested a meeting in town to discuss opportunities of mutual benefit. The words read smooth, but there was nothing friendly in their meaning. Ayanna read it once, her eyes narrowing only slightly, before she set it on the table. "They want more than they're saying," she said. I agreed, though neither of us spoke the full worry yet. We decided to hear them out, knowing it was better to stand in the room than be spoken for outside it. 2 days later, I rode into town with Ayanna beside me. The wind had a dry edge, carrying dust through the street between the mercantile and the livery. We tied off the horses and walked up to the meeting room above the telegraph office. Hensley was waiting with 2 other men, one thin and sharp-eyed, the other heavy-set with a watch chain across his vest. They spoke of surveys, rail access, and expansion, their talk circling back to the need for open tracks to be brought into proper use. I asked plainly if they meant to buy the land beyond my western fence. Hensley's answer was careful. "We intend to bring progress to this valley," he said, "and progress needs space." Ayanna's voice was steady when she told them that space already had purpose, even if they didn't see it. The meeting ended without agreement. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, the street quieter than when we'd arrived. On the ride back, neither of us spoke much. Windrunner was grazing near the corral when we returned, lifting his head as we rode in. Something in the steadiness of that sight kept my thoughts from running too far ahead. Over the next week, we kept to our work, but stayed alert. Little Wolf rode patrols along the western edge, sometimes spotting riders in the distance who turned away before he could get close. We shifted the herd to the east pasture, away from the line we thought most likely to be crossed. Ayanna's people began using a trail that skirted the ridge rather than cutting over it. One morning before sunrise, I heard hoofbeats coming fast up the yard. Little Wolf swung down from his horse, his coat damp from the ride. "They're setting stakes west of the creek," he said. 3 men with wagons. Looks like they mean to stay. We saddled up without another word, Ayanna joining us. The ground was still wet from a night rain, the air heavy with the smell of sage. We found the men where Little Wolf said they'd be driving stakes into the ground and marking lines with bright cloth. I asked them who gave permission, and they named Hensley's company. When I told them they were over the boundary, the heavy-set one from the meeting stepped forward, claiming the land wasn't marked on any deed. Ayanna rode forward, her voice carrying over the wind. She told them the land was part of her people's seasonal range, that it fed their horses and kept the herds through the lean months. The men hesitated, looking between one another. Finally, they pulled the stakes, loading them into the wagon without more talk. But their faces made it clear this wasn't the end of it. That evening, as we brought the herd in closer to the house, the wind shifted, bringing the scent of distant smoke. Ayanna stood at the fence, watching the darkening sky to the west. "They'll try another way," she said. I knew she was right. After supper, I stepped outside. The moon was thin, the air still. Windrunner moved along the corral rail, his ears turning toward some sound beyond my hearing. In the quiet, it felt like the whole valley was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The stillness of that night didn't last long. By dawn, riders from Ayana's camp came with word that Hensley's men had returned, this time with a county deputy and a stack of papers claiming rights to the land west of the ridge. We rode out together, the air cold enough to see our breath frost crunching under the horses' hooves. Windrunner led the way without being asked, his ears locked forward as if he knew exactly where we were headed. We found them near the creek, their wagons drawn up. Survey lines marked again in bright cloth. The deputy read from the papers, but I had brought my own, an original deed from my father, signed by the territorial judge, showing the western boundary in clear ink. Ayana stepped forward and laid out the seasonal maps her people had used for generations, tracing the grazing routes that tied her band to that ground. Faced with both, the deputy's stance shifted. He took the documents, folded them, and told Hensley's men they had no standing here. They didn't take the news kindly, but with the law against them and the weight of both our communities at their back, they packed their stakes and moved on. It wasn't a victory marked by cheers, just a quiet certainty that the land was safe, at least for now. We rode home slow, the sun warming the frost from the grass, the creek running strong beside us. In the days that followed, life settled back into its usual pace. The herd grazed in the high pasture, Ayana's people moved freely across the valley, and the new calves grew stronger with each passing week. Little Wolf took to teaching some of the younger hands how to track and read weather, while Ayana and I began setting posts for an extra corral. Windrunner still roamed, but he was never far from sight, his mares trailing him across the open ground. One evening, as the light faded over the mountains, Ayana and I stood by the fence watching the herd. The air was soft, carrying the smell of sweetgrass and distant pine smoke. She rested her hand on mine and said, "What we keep isn't just land. It's the space to live the way we choose." I nodded, knowing that choice had been hard-earned. Looking back, I realized it began with a single act, letting go of something I valued without expecting it back. From that, a door opened to a life I hadn't imagined. We'd faced down those who would take without asking, and we'd done it together with steadiness rather than force. The seasons will turn again, bringing new challenges with them. But the ground under our boots feels sure. And when I see Windrunner at the edge of the pasture, his mane catching the evening light, I'm reminded that the strongest bonds aren't tied by rope or law. They're chosen. If you've ever found something worth protecting or someone worth standing beside, no matter the cost, you know the kind of quiet strength that carries a person through. And if you have, I'd like to hear your story.